the story begins not with a fall, but with a world at its peak. Imagine standing in the heart of Rome at its greatest moment. The air is filled with noise, merchants shouting, soldiers marching in rhythm, fountains pouring water into marble basins. Roads stretch out like veins, connecting distant lands, from the cold forests of the north to the burning deserts of the south. Ships crowd the harbors, carrying grain, gold, silk, and stories from every corner of the known world. This was not just a city. This was the center of everything. The Roman Empire did not feel fragile. It did not feel temporary. It felt eternal. People believed it would last forever. And maybe that is where the story truly begins. Because when something seems unbreakable, the cracks are often already there, hidden beneath the surface. At its height, the empire was massive. It ruled over millions of people across 3 continents. Different languages, cultures, and religions all existed under one rule. And somehow, for a long time, it worked. But holding together something this large was never easy. Even in times of peace, Rome depended on control of land, control of people, control of power. And power in Rome was never simple. At the top stood the emperor, a single man with absolute authority. His word could build cities or destroy lives. But this power came with danger, because in Rome, being emperor did not just mean ruling. It meant surviving. Many emperors did not die peacefully. Some were poisoned. Others were betrayed. Some were killed by the very soldiers meant to protect them. The throne of Rome was not a seat of comfort. It was a seat of constant threat. And over time, this instability began to grow. After the death of strong emperors, the empire often fell into chaos. Generals fought each other for control. Armies declared their own leaders as emperors. Civil wars broke out again and again, weakening the unity that once held Rome together. Imagine being a citizen during these times. One year, you pledge loyalty to one emperor. The next year, he is gone, killed, or overthrown, and a new ruler demands your loyalty. Taxes change. Laws shift. The future becomes uncertain, and uncertainty spreads fear. But the problems were not only political. Far beyond the walls of Rome, along its long borders, danger was growing. The empire had always faced threats from outside tribes and groups who lived beyond Roman control. For years, Rome had kept them back with strong armies and fortified borders. But maintaining this defense required money and soldiers and constant attention. And slowly, Rome began to struggle with all 3. The army, once a symbol of strength and discipline, started to change. Recruiting Roman citizens became harder, so the empire began to rely more on foreign soldiers, men who did not always share the same loyalty or identity. At the same time, the cost of maintaining such a vast empire grew heavier. Roads, armies, cities, administration It all required resources, and those resources had to come from somewhere. Taxes increased. For the rich, this was an inconvenience, but for ordinary people, it became a burden. Farmers struggled to keep their land. Small businesses suffered. Many people fell into poverty, while the gap between rich and poor grew wider. And when people begin to struggle, trust in the system begins to fade. Still, from the outside, Rome looked powerful. Its cities were grand. Its laws were respected. Its influence stretched far and wide. But inside, something was shifting. The unity that once defined Rome was slowly weakening. Different regions of the empire began to feel less connected to the center. Local leaders gained more power. Communication across vast distances became slower and more difficult. Decisions made in Rome did not always fit the realities of distant provinces. It was like trying to control a giant machine with parts that no longer moved in sync. And then there was another change, a quiet but powerful transformation that began not with armies or politics, but with belief. For centuries, Rome had followed traditional gods. Rituals, temples, and sacrifices were part of daily life. But now, a new religion was spreading, one that would slowly reshape the identity of the empire itself. Christianity. At first, it was small, even persecuted. But over time, it grew. More people began to follow it, even within the highest levels of society. This shift brought hope to many, but also tension, because when beliefs change, societies change. And Rome was beginning to change in ways no one fully understood. The empire was still standing, still powerful, still feared, but beneath the surface, pressures were building. Political instability, economic strain, military challenges, cultural transformation. Each one alone might not have been enough to break Rome, but together they were forming something dangerous. A slow, invisible force. A force that does not destroy overnight, but weakens bit by bit, until even the strongest structures begin to fall. And as the empire continued forward, unaware of how close it was to a turning point, a new generation of leaders would rise. Some would try to save Rome. Others would unknowingly push it closer to collapse. And the decisions they made would change history forever. Because the fall of Rome was not a single event. It was a story, a long, unfolding story. And it was only just beginning. The illusion of stability does not shatter all at once. It fades slowly, like a grand painting left out in the sun. Its colors weakening day by day until one morning, you finally notice something is no longer right. For Rome, that moment came in the 3rd century. What had once been a strong, unified empire began to fracture under pressure, not from a single enemy, not from one catastrophic event, but from a storm of problems that struck all at once, from every direction. Historians would later call this time the the crisis of the 3rd century. But for the people living through it, it was simply chaos. Emperors came and went like shadows. In just a few decades, Rome saw dozens of rulers rise to power and fall just as quickly. Some ruled for only a few months. Others barely had time to secure their position before being betrayed, assassinated, or replaced. Imagine waking up one day to news that your emperor has been killed. Then, before you can even process it, another name is announced, and then another. Loyalty becomes meaningless when power changes hands so quickly. The army, once the backbone of Rome, had now become its greatest political force. Soldiers no longer just defended the empire, they decided who ruled it. Generals would promise wealth and rewards to their troops, gaining their support, and then march toward Rome to claim the throne. It was no longer about who could govern best. It was about who could take power and hold it long enough to survive. And while Rome fought itself from within, enemies from outside began to notice. Along the borders, pressure increased. In the east, the powerful Sassanid Empire rose as a serious threat. Unlike earlier enemies, they were organized, determined, and capable of challenging Rome on equal terms. They attacked Roman territories, captured cities, and even humiliated Roman leaders in ways that would have been unthinkable before. In the north, Germanic tribes, groups that had long lived beyond Rome's borders, began to push closer. These were not unified nations, but loose groups of warriors and families seeking land, wealth, and survival. As pressure grew in their own regions, they began to test the strength of Roman defenses, and what they found was weakness. The Roman army was stretched thin, with civil wars constantly breaking out. Troops were often pulled away from the borders to fight internal battles. Fortifications were left vulnerable. Response times slowed. The shield that once protected the empire was cracking. At the same time, a silent crisis was spreading through the economy. Money began to lose its value. To pay for endless wars and satisfy the demands of the army, emperors started to produce more coins, but with less silver in them. On the surface, nothing seemed different. But over time, people realized the truth. The coins were worth less. Prices began to rise. Food became more expensive. Basic goods became harder to afford. This is what we now call inflation. But for the people of Rome, it felt like something far worse. It felt like the system itself was breaking. Farmers abandoned their lands, unable to survive under heavy taxes and rising costs. Trade slowed down. Cities that once thrived with activity began to feel quieter, emptier. And with economic collapse came another invisible enemy: disease. A devastating plague spread across the empire, killing millions. It moved silently from city to city, carried along the very roads that once symbolized Rome's greatness. Entire communities were wiped out. families disappeared. The population shrank, and with fewer people came fewer soldiers, fewer workers, fewer taxpayers. The empire was losing not just strength, but life itself. Yet, despite all this, Rome did not fall. Not yet, because even in its darkest moments, there were those who refused to let it collapse. Strong leaders began to emerge, men who understood the depth of the crisis and were willing to take drastic action to save the empire. One of them was Emperor Aurelian. Aurelian was not born into power. He rose through the ranks of the military, proving himself through discipline and skill. When he became emperor, he faced a broken empire divided, weakened, and on the edge of collapse. And yet, he fought back. He pushed the enemies away from the borders. He defeated rival leaders. He reunified parts of the empire that had broken off during the chaos. Under his rule, Rome began to stabilize, if only for a moment. He even built massive walls around the city of Rome itself, walls that still stand in parts today. It was a powerful symbol. For the first time, Rome, the city that once ruled the world without fear, felt the need to protect itself. Think about that. The heart of the empire now needed walls. It was a sign of change, a sign that the world around Rome was no longer under its full control. But just as quickly as hope appeared, it was taken away. Aurelian was assassinated. Another emperor lost. Another moment of stability gone. And the cycle continued. Chaos, reform, death, chaos again. Still, the empire endured. It bent, but did not break. Not yet. Because another figure was about to rise. Someone who would not just try to fix the empire, but completely transform it. A man who understood that Rome could no longer survive as it once had. A man who would divide power, reshape leadership, and attempt to bring order to the chaos. His name was Diocletian, and what he was about to do would change the Roman Empire forever. By the time Diocletian rose to power, Rome was no longer the empire it once had been. It still stood, but just barely. Years of chaos had left deep scars. Emperors had been killed one after another. Armies had turned against their own leaders. Borders had been pushed and tested. The economy was unstable, and the people were tired of uncertainty, tired of fear, tired of watching their world slowly fall apart. This was the Rome Diocletian inherited. A broken system, a fragile empire, and yet he did not try to restore the past. He understood something others had not. Rome was too big, too complex, too stretched to be ruled by one man alone. And so, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of keeping power for himself, he divided it. Not out of weakness, but out of strategy. He created a system where multiple rulers would govern different parts of the empire. It was called the Tetrarchy, a rule of 4. 2 senior emperors, known as Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, known as Caesars, each one responsible for a different region, each one able to respond quickly to threats, each one sharing the burden of leadership. It was a radical idea. For centuries, Rome had been built on the concept of a single ruler at the top. Now, that idea was being reshaped into something new, something more flexible, something designed to survive. And for a time, it worked. With multiple leaders, the empire became more stable. Armies were better organized. Borders were defended more efficiently. Rebellions were crushed before they could spread. Order slowly began to return. But Diocletian did not stop there. He knew that political reform alone was not enough. The problems of Rome ran deeper. The economy needed control. Inflation had spiraled out of control. Prices kept rising, and money kept losing value. So Diocletian did something bold and desperate. He issued an edict to fix prices across the empire. Imagine that. A ruler trying to control the cost of everything: food, clothing, labor, by law. At first, it seemed like a solution, but in reality, it was impossible. Merchants refused to sell goods at fixed prices. Black markets began to grow. Trade became more difficult, and instead of solving the problem, it often made it worse. Still, Diocletian pressed on. He reformed the tax system, making it more organized and predictable. But this also meant stricter control over people's lives. Farmers were tied to their land. Workers were tied to their professions. Freedom slowly began to shrink. The empire was becoming more controlled, more rigid, more stable, perhaps, but also more restrictive. And then there was religion. For years, a quiet transformation had been taking place within the empire. Christianity had been spreading. Slowly at first, then more rapidly. It offered something different, a sense of hope, a promise of salvation, a belief in one God rather than many. For many people, especially during times of crisis, this message was powerful. But for Diocletian, it was a threat, because Rome had always been built on tradition, on shared rituals, on loyalty not just to the state, but to its gods. And Christianity challenged that. It refused to honor the traditional Roman gods. It refused to see the emperor as divine. To Diocletian, this was not just a religious issue. It was a question of unity. And so he acted. What followed would become one of the most intense periods of persecution in Roman history. Christians were arrested. Churches were destroyed. Sacred texts were burned. People were forced to abandon their beliefs or face punishment, imprisonment, even death. It was harsh. It was brutal. And yet, it did not stop the spread of Christianity. In many ways, it made it stronger. Because belief, once rooted deeply enough, does not disappear under pressure. It grows, quietly, steadily, waiting. And while this was happening, Diocletian made one final, unexpected decision. He stepped down, voluntarily. For the first time in Roman history, an emperor gave up power by choice. It was almost unthinkable. After years of chaos, reform, and control, he simply walked away, leaving behind a system he believed could sustain itself. But systems, no matter how well designed, depend on the people who run them. And once Diocletian was gone, the balance began to shift. The Tetrarchy, which had brought stability, now became a source of rivalry. The four rulers, meant to cooperate, began to compete. Ambition returned. Trust faded. And once again, the empire edged toward conflict. Because power in Rome was never something easily shared. And soon, one man would rise above the others, a man who would reunite the empire under a single ruler once more, a man who would change not just politics, but belief itself. His name was Constantine the Great, and his story would mark the beginning of a new Rome, a different Rome, one that looked familiar on the surface, but was slowly becoming something entirely new. When Constantine the Great entered the stage, the Roman Empire was still searching for stability. The system left behind by Diocletian had delayed collapse, but it had not solved everything. Power was divided, but ambition was not. And in Rome, ambition always finds a way to rise. Constantine was not born into certainty. His path to power was shaped by conflict, by alliances, by moments where survival depended on bold decisions. He grew up watching the struggles of the empire, understanding from a young age that strength alone was not enough. You needed timing, strategy, and sometimes belief. Because in a world filled with shifting loyalties, what you believed in could shape everything. The moment that defined Constantine came before a battle that would decide his future. The air was tense. Soldiers prepared for war. The outcome was uncertain, and according to later accounts, Constantine experienced something unusual, something that would change not only his life, but the future of the entire empire. He saw a vision, a symbol in the sky, a cross accompanied by a message. In this sign, you will conquer. Whether it was real, imagined, or shaped by later storytelling, one thing is certain: Constantine believed it. And belief can be more powerful than reality. The next day, his forces marched into the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. It was decisive. Constantine won, and with that victory, he did not just gain power, he gained purpose. Soon after, he made a decision that would reshape Rome forever. He embraced Christianity, not immediately as the empire's official religion, but as something protected, something allowed to grow freely. This was a turning point. For centuries, Christians had been persecuted, hunted, punished, forced to hide their beliefs. Now, under Constantine, that changed. He issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance across the empire. Imagine the shift. A faith once pushed into the shadows, now stepping into the light. Churches began to rise. Communities expanded. Belief spread faster than ever before. And Constantine did more than just allow Christianity. He supported it. He funded churches. He involved himself in religious matters. He even called meetings of church leaders to settle disputes and unify doctrine. The emperor, now shaping religion. It was something new, something powerful, but it also created tension, because while many embraced this change, others held onto the old traditions. The old gods, the old rituals, the old identity of Rome, they did not disappear overnight. Now, the empire was not just divided by politics or geography, but by belief. Still, Constantine continued forward. He was not just focused on religion. He was rebuilding the structure of the empire itself. And one of his most important decisions was not about laws or armies, but about location. He looked east, toward a region that was richer, more stable, more connected to trade and resources. And there, he made a choice that would echo through history. He founded a new capital, a new center of power, a new Rome. The city was called Constantinople. Built on the site of an ancient city, it was positioned perfectly between Europe and Asia, between East and West, between past and future. While Rome, the old capital, still stood, its importance began to fade. Power was shifting. Eastward, Constantinople grew rapidly. It became a center of culture, wealth, and administration. Strong walls protected it. Trade routes flowed through it. It was vibrant, alive, and full of promise. And slowly, quietly, the balance of the empire began to change. The West, including the original city of Rome, began to weaken. Economic struggles continued. Political instability lingered. While the East grew stronger, the West struggled to keep up. It was not yet obvious, but the seeds of division were being planted. Two halves of one empire, moving in different directions. And even though Constantine had reunited the empire under one ruler, he had also, in a way, prepared it for separation. Because after his death, power would once again be divided, not through reform, but through necessity. The empire was simply too large, too different, too complex to remain united forever. And so, the question began to form, not if Rome would change, but how, because change was no longer avoidable. It was already happening. In the shifting power of East and West, in the growing influence of Christianity, in the weakening grip of old traditions, Rome still stood, still proud, still powerful. But it was no longer the same Rome that once ruled without question. It was evolving, and not all evolution leads to survival. Because as the empire continued forward, new pressures would rise. Stronger enemies, deeper divisions, and a slow, unstoppable drift towards something that no one could fully see yet, but was coming closer with every passing year. After the death of Constantine the Great, the empire did not collapse, but it changed quietly, deeply, and in ways that would become impossible to reverse. The unity he had rebuilt did not last long. Instead, power was divided once again, this time not as an experiment like the Tetrarchy, but as a practical reality. The empire was simply too vast, too complex, and too different across regions to be governed as a single, unified body. And so, it became something new. Two halves, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. At first, this division did not seem dangerous. Both halves still saw themselves as part of one empire. They shared laws, culture, and history. They even recognized the same imperial authority, at least in theory. But in reality, they were becoming very different worlds. The Eastern Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, was strong. It had wealth, stable leadership, and access to major trade routes. Its cities were active and growing. Its defenses were solid. It was organized, efficient, resilient. The Western Empire, however, was struggling. Its lands were larger, but harder to control. Its economy was weaker. Its cities, including Rome itself, were no longer the center of power they once had been. Trade declined. Infrastructure weakened, and the constant need to defend long, exposed borders drained its already limited resources. It was like watching two branches of the same tree grow in opposite directions, one reaching upward, strong and steady, the other slowly bending under pressure. And then came a moment that made this division official. The reign of Theodosius I. Theodosius was a powerful emperor. He ruled over both East and West, managing to hold the empire together during his lifetime. But he also made a decision that would define the future. When he died, he divided the empire between his two sons. The East would go to one, the West to the other. It was not meant to be a permanent split, but it became one, because once divided, the empire never truly reunited again. From that moment forward, the Western Roman Empire stood on its own, and it was not ready. The problems that had been building for decades now became harder to ignore. The Western economy continued to weaken. Without strong trade networks and consistent resources, it struggled to support its population and its army. Taxes increased, but they were not enough. Corruption grew. Wealth became concentrated among a small elite, while ordinary people faced increasing hardship. Many farmers abandoned their lands, unable to survive under heavy taxation and constant instability. Some even placed themselves under the protection of powerful landowners, trading freedom for security. Slowly, the structure of Roman society began to change. Less freedom, more dependence, more fear. At the same time, the military, once the pride of Rome, was undergoing its own transformation. The Western Empire found it increasingly difficult to recruit and maintain a strong army. Roman citizens were less willing to serve, and resources were limited. So, like before, they turned to foreign soldiers, barbarian mercenaries, men from beyond the empire's borders, hired to defend it. At first, this seemed like a solution. These warriors were skilled, they were strong, and they helped fill the gaps in the Roman military. But there was a deeper problem. Their loyalty was not always to Rome. It was to their leaders, to their tribes, to their own survival. And sometimes those loyalties would shift. Meanwhile, beyond the borders, pressure continued to grow. Entire groups of people were moving, not just raiding, but migrating, seeking land, safety, and opportunity. Among them were the Visigoths, a powerful group that would soon play a central role in Rome's story. At first, they did not come as enemies. They came as refugees, fleeing from an even greater threat, the Huns. The Huns were fierce, fast-moving warriors from the east. Their arrival pushed other tribes westward, toward Roman territory. The Visigoths, desperate and displaced, sought permission to enter the empire, and Rome allowed them. It seemed like a reasonable decision. Let them settle. Let them become part of the empire. But what followed was not integration, it was tension. The Visigoths were mistreated by Roman officials. They were exploited, underfed, and disrespected. Promises were broken. Trust was lost. And when people who are already desperate are pushed too far, they fight back. What began as a migration turned into rebellion. The Visigoths rose up against Roman authority, and the empire, already weakened, struggled to respond. This was no longer a distant threat at the border. This was inside the empire, a challenge from within, and it would lead to a moment that shocked the world. A moment that no one thought possible. Because for centuries, the city of Rome had stood as a symbol of power, strength, and dominance. It had never been taken by an enemy, not in hundreds of years. It was untouchable, or at least that's what people believed. But belief does not always match reality, and as tensions rose, as armies moved, as leaders made decisions that could not be undone, the unthinkable began to approach. Because the walls of Rome were about to be tested, and for the first time in centuries, they would not hold. For centuries, the city of Rome had been more than just a capital. It was a symbol of power, of order, of a world that had been shaped by its will. Empires rose and fell beyond its borders, but Rome remained, untouched, unshaken, eternal, or at least that's what people believed. But in the early 5th century, that belief was about to be broken. The Visigoths, once refugees seeking safety within the empire, had now become something else entirely. A force driven not just by survival, but by anger. Their leader, Alaric I, was not a reckless invader. He was strategic, calculated. He understood Rome not just as a city, but as a system. He had once served within the Roman military. He knew its strengths, and more importantly, he knew its weaknesses. For years, Alaric and his people had tried to find a place within the empire. They wanted land, security, recognition. But time and time again, they were denied, ignored, or betrayed. So they marched, not just as enemies, but as a people who felt they had no other choice. As the Visigoths moved through Italy, fear spread. Villages were abandoned. Cities prepared for defense. Messengers rushed across roads that once carried trade, now carrying warnings. And at the center of it all was Rome. The great city, the heart of an empire that had ruled for centuries. But this was not the Rome of old. Its political power had already shifted to other cities. Its population had declined. Its defenses were not what they once were. Still, it stood. Still, it believed itself untouchable. Alaric approached the city more than once. At first, he did not attack. He negotiated. He demanded payment, food, land for his people. And Rome agreed. Gold was handed over. Supplies were given. Promises were made. But none of it lasted, because these were temporary solutions to deeper problems. And when those problems remained, so did the threat. Negotiations failed. Tensions rose. And finally, in the year 410 AD, it happened. The gates of Rome were opened, not by force alone, but from within. And the Visigoths entered the city. The unthinkable had become reality. The sack of Rome. For 3 days, the city was at the mercy of the invaders. Homes were looted. Buildings were damaged. Wealth, collected over centuries, was taken. People fled in terror, hiding wherever they could, hoping to survive. The streets that once echoed with triumph and celebration now carried fear and uncertainty. But this was not total destruction. Alaric had given orders. Certain places were to be respected, especially Christian churches. Even in conquest, there were limits. Still, the damage was done, not just to the city, but to the idea of Rome itself. Because Rome had been more than walls and buildings. It had been a symbol of invincibility. And now, that symbol was broken. When news spread across the empire and beyond, it sent shockwaves through the world. How could this happen? How could the greatest city on earth fall to an enemy? The psychological impact was enormous. If Rome could be taken, what was safe? What was secure? What did the future hold? Even those far from the city felt the weight of this moment. It was not just a military defeat. It was a turning point. A signal that the Western Roman Empire was no longer in control. That its strength was fading. That its enemies were no longer at the gates, but inside. And yet, even after this, the empire did not end. It continued, weakened, shaken, still alive, because Rome had always been resilient. It adapted, it endured, it found ways to survive. But something had changed, something fundamental. The confidence was gone. The belief in eternal power had been replaced by doubt. And once doubt enters, it spreads. In the years that followed, more pressures would build. More groups would move into Roman lands. More territories would slip away, and leadership in the West would grow weaker, less capable of responding to the challenges ahead. Because the sack of Rome was not the end, it was a warning, a glimpse of what was coming. And what was coming was far greater. A storm that would not just shake the empire, but tear it apart piece by piece. After the sack of Rome in 410 AD, the empire did not collapse overnight. It lingered, like a great structure with its foundation weakened, still standing, but no longer stable. From the outside, there were still emperors, still armies, still the idea of Roman authority. But inside, the cracks were widening. The Western Roman Empire was losing control slowly, piece by piece. And beyond its borders, something was moving. Something faster, more unpredictable, and more terrifying than anything Rome had faced before. The Huns. They did not build cities like Rome. They did not follow the same traditions or rules. They were not tied to land in the same way. They moved, swiftly, ruthlessly, across vast distances, riding horses, striking quickly, disappearing just as fast. To many in the Roman world, they seemed almost unstoppable, like a force of nature, rather than an army. And at their head was a man whose name would become legendary. Attila the Hun. Attila was not just a warrior. He was a leader who understood fear. He used it. He shaped it. He made it part of his strategy. Cities that resisted him were destroyed. Those that surrendered were often spared, but only after paying heavy tribute. His presence alone was enough to make entire regions panic. Even the Eastern Roman Empire, stronger and more stable than the West, chose at times to pay him just to avoid destruction. Think about that. Rome paying for peace, not winning it, not enforcing it, buying it. And while the East managed to hold him back through wealth and negotiation, the West was far more vulnerable, because the Western Empire no longer had the strength to deal with such a threat. Its armies were weaker, its leadership less decisive, its resources stretched thin. And so, when Attila turned his attention toward the West, there was little to stop him. He invaded Gaul, modern-day France, burning towns, spreading fear, and pushing deeper into Roman territory. For a moment, it seemed like nothing could stop him. But then, something unexpected happened. A rare moment of unity. Roman forces, along with their former enemies, the Visigoths, joined together to face the Huns. It was an unusual alliance. Enemies fighting side by side, because sometimes the threat is so great that differences must be set aside. The two forces met in a massive confrontation known as the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. It was one of the largest battles of the time. The fighting was intense, brutal, uncertain. But in the end, Attila was forced to retreat. It was not a complete defeat, but it was enough to stop his advance for a while. For Rome, it was a small victory in a time of constant loss. A moment where the empire, or what remained of it, managed to stand its ground. But victories like this were becoming rare. And they did not last, because Attila was not finished. The following year, he invaded Italy itself, the heart of the Western Empire. Cities fell before him. Panic spread once again. People fled, abandoning homes, leaving behind everything they had built. And once again, Rome stood in his path, the same city that had been sacked only decades earlier, the same symbol of a fading empire. This time, however, something strange happened. Attila did not attack the city. Instead, he withdrew. The reasons are still debated. Some say it was disease among his troops. Others say it was a lack of supplies, and some point to a meeting with Pope Leo I, who approached Attila and convinced him to turn back. Whatever the reason, Rome was spared, but only temporarily, because even though Attila retreated, the damage had already been done. The empire had once again been pushed to its limits, and it was becoming clear it could not keep surviving like this. Soon after, Attila died, unexpectedly, and with his death, the power of the Huns began to fade. Their empire, built on strength and fear, quickly fell apart without him. For a brief moment, it may have seemed like a relief, like the storm had passed. But in reality, the storm had only changed form. Because the Huns were never the only threat, they had simply pushed others forward. And now, those groups, Visigoths, Vandals, and others, were no longer just moving into Roman lands. They were taking them, settling, building their own kingdoms within what had once been Roman territory. The Western Empire was no longer losing battles. It was losing land, losing control, losing identity, and perhaps most dangerously, losing authority. Because when people no longer believe in the power of a government, that government begins to disappear even before it officially ends. Emperors still sat on the throne, but many were weak. Some were controlled by generals. Others were little more than symbols. Real power was shifting away from Rome, away from the emperor, into the hands of military leaders and foreign kings. The structure of the empire was no longer holding. It was unraveling, slowly but steadily. And as this unraveling continued, one more event would strike the empire, an event that would once again shock the world. Another sack, another blow, but this time even more devastating, because Rome would not just be invaded, it would be humiliated. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was no longer a strong, unified force. It was something else, a shadow of what it once had been. The structures still existed: emperors, officials, armies, but they no longer carried the same weight. Authority was fragile. Control was uncertain. And across the former territories of Rome, new powers were rising. Among them, the Vandals. They were not new to the story. Like many other groups, they had once lived beyond the borders of the empire. Over time, pushed by pressure, conflict, and opportunity, they moved westward, entering Roman lands. But the Vandals did something different. They did not just settle. They kept moving. Through Gaul, into Spain, and eventually across the sea into North Africa. And there they found something incredibly valuable. Land. Rich, fertile land. And more importantly, control. Under their leader, Genseric, they established a powerful kingdom in North Africa, one of the most important regions of the Western Roman Empire. Why was this so important? Because North Africa was not just another province. It was the breadbasket of the West. Grain from this region fed cities, supported armies, and kept the population alive. Now, it was no longer under Roman control. The loss was devastating. Without North Africa, the Western Empire lost a major source of food and revenue. Its already weakened economy took another heavy blow. Its ability to sustain itself became even more fragile. But Genseric did not stop there. He built a navy, a strong one, and with it, he controlled the Western Mediterranean. Trade routes were no longer safe. Roman ships were vulnerable. Coastal cities lived in fear of sudden attacks. The Vandals were no longer just a land power. They were a sea power, and they were growing stronger while Rome continued to weaken. Then, in the year 455 AD, everything came to a breaking point. Political instability in Rome had reached another peak. Emperors were being replaced, manipulated, or removed. Leadership was uncertain. Decisions were reactive, not strategic. And in this moment of weakness, Genseric made his move. The Vandals sailed toward Italy, toward Rome, the same city that had already been sacked once before. But this time, the situation was even worse. Rome was not prepared. Its defenses were weak. Its leadership divided. Its people already living in fear. When the Vandals arrived, there was little resistance. No great battle. No strong defense. Only inevitability. And so, for the second time in less than 50 years, Rome was sacked. The sack of Rome, 455 AD. But this was different from the first. When Alaric I had entered Rome, there had been some restraint, limits, a sense of order, even in chaos. With the Vandals, there was far less. For 2 weeks, the city was looted. Systematically, thoroughly. Treasures were taken: gold, silver, art, anything of value. Important buildings were stripped. generations of wealth removed. People were taken as captives. The city was not just invaded, it was emptied. The term vandalism, which we use today, comes from this moment, because the destruction left behind was unforgettable. Yet again, Rome, the once invincible heart of an empire, had been humiliated. And this time, the damage cut even deeper, because now it was no longer shocking. It was expected. The world had begun to accept something unthinkable just a century earlier, that Rome could fall again and again without recovering, and that realization changed everything. The psychological impact was immense. If Rome could not protect itself, how could it protect anyone else? If the center of the empire was vulnerable, what did that mean for the rest? Across the Western Empire, local leaders began to rely less on Rome and more on themselves. Generals took control of regions. Barbarian kings ruled lands that once answered to the emperor. The empire was no longer unified in any real sense. It was breaking apart, quietly, irreversibly. The emperor still existed, but his power was fading into symbolism. Decisions were no longer his to make. Control was no longer his to enforce. And soon, even the title itself would begin to lose meaning. Because what is an emperor without an empire? As the years passed, the Western Roman Empire moved closer and closer to its final moment, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a slow, quiet unraveling. Territory lost, authority weakened, identity fading, until finally there would be almost nothing left to hold together. And when that moment came, it would not be marked by a great battle or a powerful last stand, but by something far more silent, a simple act, a removal, the end not with a roar, but with a quiet, inevitable shift. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was no longer the mighty force that had once dominated Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Its lands were fragmented, its armies were depleted, its coffers were nearly empty. Its people were weary from decades of war, famine, and instability. And its leaders, they were more figureheads than rulers. The emperors of this period were often chosen not for skill or wisdom, but for convenience, puppet rulers controlled by powerful generals, foreign kings, or influential senators. Their authority existed more on paper than in reality. And then came the final act. In 476 AD, a young man named Romulus Augustulus sat on the throne. He was barely a teenager. A boy, really. His rule was symbolic, fragile, and entirely dependent on the loyalty of those around him. Across the empire, real power was held by a man named Odoacer. He was a skilled general, a leader of mercenary forces, and a man who understood that Rome's authority no longer meant what it once had. Odoacer had no desire to destroy Rome for the sake of vengeance. He understood the reality of the empire He simply wanted control, stability, and recognition. And when he approached young Romulus Augustulus, the choice was clear. The boy emperor was deposed, not killed, not humiliated, but removed. He was sent into quiet exile, a symbolic gesture that marked the end of centuries of Roman imperial rule in the West. With that simple act, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. There was no massive battle, no dramatic siege, no final heroic stand, just the quiet acknowledgement that the structures, the systems, and the authority that had once held an empire together were gone. Rome itself remained. The city would continue to exist for centuries. Its culture, its traditions, and its buildings survived. The church, now a powerful institution, preserved the knowledge and authority that had once belonged to emperors. But the Western Empire, the political entity that had ruled over countless peoples, lands, and cultures, was no more. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, survived. In many ways, it thrived. It preserved Roman law, administration, and military strength for another 1,000 years. But the West was fractured. The lands that had once answered to Rome were now ruled by a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms. The Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Franks, and others. This shift reshaped Europe forever. Borders, cultures, languages, and traditions would evolve in the absence of centralized Roman authority. The idea of Rome, the memory of its power, and its achievements remained strong, but the political reality was gone. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single event. It was the result of centuries of accumulation. Economic collapse, political instability, military pressures, internal decay, and the relentless movement of peoples across Europe. Each event, each invasion, each rebellion, each economic strain added to the slow unraveling. And by the time Romulus Augustulus was deposed, the end was inevitable. Yet in this quiet ending, there is also a beginning. The vacuum left by Rome's fall allowed new powers to rise, new kingdoms to form, and new histories to be written. Europe entered the medieval period, a world shaped by both the memory of Rome and the realities of the tribes and leaders who replaced it. The fall of Rome was not only a political event, it was cultural, psychological, and symbolic. The world changed. The era of empires like Rome would not return in the West, but the story of Rome, its achievements, its architecture, its law, and its legacy would endure. And yet, as one empire ended, the East continued. Constantinople would face its own challenges, own enemies, and its own eventual fall. The story of Rome was not yet fully over. It had simply moved east, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. With the Western Roman Empire gone, Europe entered a world both familiar and entirely new. The lands that had once been governed by emperors, senators, and legions were now divided among Germanic kingdoms, each with its own rules, customs, and ambitions. The Vandals controlled North Africa. The Visigoths held parts of Spain and Gaul, and the Ostrogoths moved into Italy. The Franks, the Angles, and the Saxons carved out territories in the north. Rome itself, once the heart of the empire, now stood as a city under foreign influence, its streets still echoing with memories of imperial triumph, but its political power a distant memory. Yet the fall of the Western Empire did not mean the end of Roman influence. On the contrary, Roman law, administration, and culture survived in ways that many people at the time might not have realized. Local rulers adopted Roman systems of taxation, governance, and military organization. Latin remained the language of administration and scholarship, while Roman roads, aqueducts, and architecture continued to shape the landscape. The church, which had grown increasingly powerful during the final centuries of the empire, became the new anchor of stability. Bishops and religious leaders assumed roles that were once the domain of governors and emperors, guiding communities, mediating disputes, and preserving knowledge. In many ways, the church became the heir of Rome's authority. Monasteries safeguarded texts, educated new generations, and maintained the continuity of Roman culture. In a world fractured by migration and conflict, Christianity offered a common identity, a sense of order, and a moral framework that bound people together. The Western Roman Empire had fallen, but its ideals, its laws, and its vision endured, quietly shaping the emerging medieval world. Meanwhile, the Germanic kingdoms were learning from Rome, even as they displaced it. They adopted administrative techniques, coinage systems, and architectural methods. Kingship in these new lands was often modeled on Roman precedents, even if the rulers themselves were from entirely different cultures. This blending of Roman tradition with Germanic innovation created the foundation for what would eventually become medieval Europe, a world where Roman ideas and structures coexisted with new powers, new customs, and new identities. Trade, too, continued to link these fragmented lands. Though the Western Empire had collapsed, the Mediterranean remained a network of commerce, connecting cities and kingdoms. North African grain still fed southern Europe, though now under Vandal control. Ports and trade routes became the lifelines of emerging powers, and cities like Ravenna and Milan grew in importance as centers of administration and commerce, replacing Rome in practical terms, even as the memory of Rome's grandeur lingered. The fall of the Western Roman Empire also had profound psychological and cultural consequences. For centuries, people had believed in the eternal nature of Rome. Its collapse shattered that illusion, forcing societies to confront uncertainty, vulnerability, and change. The idea that even the greatest empire could could fall became a cautionary tale that would echo through European history, influencing politics, literature, and thought for generations. Stories of Rome's power, its victories, and its losses were retold, not just as history, but as lessons on leadership, ambition, and the fragility of human achievement. Yet, amid all this change, the legacy of Rome endured in ways both visible and invisible. Roman roads guided travelers and armies for centuries. Aqueducts continued to bring water to towns. Public buildings, theaters, and forums influenced medieval architecture. Laws codified by Roman jurists provided the foundation for European legal systems. Even language, Latin, remained the root of many modern tongues, and the language of scholarship and administration long after the political empire had vanished. In essence, the fall of Rome was not an erasure. It was a transformation. The Western Empire ceased to exist, but its culture, knowledge, and innovations became the soil from which medieval Europe would grow. The empire's collapse created a space for new powers, new identities, and new possibilities. It marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. And yet, the story of Rome was far from over. Its memory would inspire emperors, kings, and popes. Its legal codes would guide new nations. Its architecture would influence cities for centuries. Its ideals of governance, citizenship, and law would become the foundation for the civilizations that followed. The Western Roman Empire fell, yes, but its shadow stretched across time. Long after the final emperor had stepped down, long after the legions had disbanded, and long after the city of Rome had been sacked and plundered, the fall of Rome reminds us that even the greatest powers are mortal, that empires can crumble under the weight of their own complexity, external pressures, and internal decay. And yet, it also reminds us that what is built, learned, and remembered can endure far beyond the life of any one ruler, any one city, or any one political entity. The Western Roman Empire may have fallen, but the world it shaped and the echoes of its greatness continue to reverberate even today. From the ruins of Rome rose new kingdoms. From the displacement of peoples arose new cultures. From the collapse of centralized authority arose a new Europe, one forever shaped by the memory of a city that once believed itself eternal. And in that memory, the story of Rome lives on, an enduring testament to the power, glory, and fragility of human civilization. While the Western Roman Empire crumbled into fragments of kingdoms and territories, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, stood as a beacon of resilience. Unlike its Western counterpart, Constantinople was fortified, wealthy, and strategically positioned between Europe and Asia. Its walls, some of the most sophisticated defensive structures of the time, protected the city against countless sieges. And behind those walls, the machinery of the empire its administration, economy, and military remained strong. The Eastern Empire, which we now often call the Byzantine Empire, became the new Rome. It carried the name, the traditions, and the vision of what Rome had once been. Even as the West fell apart, emperors like Theodosius II and later Justinian, I understood that survival meant adaptation. They could not rely solely on brute strength. They needed diplomacy, intelligence, and a vision that blended Roman tradition with the realities of a changing world. In Constantinople, life thrived. Markets overflowed with goods from across the Mediterranean, from Egypt's grain to spices from India. Scholars studied law, philosophy, and science, preserving knowledge that might have been lost in the chaos of the West. Artisans built magnificent churches, such as the Hagia Sophia, whose domes and mosaics would inspire awe for centuries. Here, the legacy of Rome was alive, not just as memory, but as living, breathing civilization. Yet, even the Eastern Empire faced constant threats. The Huns, the Persians, and later, the Slavs pressed against its borders. Internal politics were fraught with intrigue, rebellion, and succession crises. Every emperor faced the delicate challenge of balancing military power, bureaucratic administration, and religious authority. But through careful strategy and sheer will, the Eastern Empire endured. Its survival demonstrated that Rome, though fallen in the West, could persist where foundations were stronger. Leadership was decisive, and culture was deeply rooted. Meanwhile, in the Western lands, the fall of Rome had allowed new identities to flourish. Germanic tribes that once served as mercenaries for Rome now established dynasties of their own. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, and the Franks in Gaul became the new rulers, blending their traditions with Roman customs. Laws were adapted, cities maintained, and Christianity spread as a unifying force. Even without an emperor, the Western world was evolving, slowly absorbing the remnants of Roman civilization while creating something entirely new. But the shadow of Rome still lingered. People looked to the past for legitimacy. Kings claimed authority through Roman titles or by associating themselves with Roman heritage. Churches maintained Roman ritual and governance, and scholars continued to study Roman texts. The fall of the West had created a vacuum, but Rome's legacy filled it, shaping the medieval order before a single stone had been laid for the castles and cathedrals that would dominate Europe for centuries. Trade, culture, and knowledge did not disappear with the Western Empire. Rome's roads continued to connect regions, even if the armies that once patrolled them were gone. Cities such as Ravenna, Milan, and Carthage retained importance under new rulers. Mediterranean trade persisted, linking Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. The Vandals, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths all relied on systems inherited from Rome, demonstrating that even in conquest, Rome's influence endured. Religion became a central pillar of identity. As secular authority weakened in the West, the Church strengthened. Bishops and abbots became local leaders, arbiters of justice, and preservers of culture. Christianity offered continuity in a fragmented world, keeping Roman ideas alive even as political structures crumbled. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible, but profound. A shift from imperial power to spiritual and cultural authority. Yet, beneath the surface of this survival, questions lingered. Could any empire truly last forever? How long could Constantinople withstand the pressures of enemies and internal strife? And what lessons would the West take from Rome's collapse, or fail to take? These questions would echo for centuries, as Europe navigated the uncertain terrain left in the wake of Rome's fall, even as the Eastern Empire preserved Roman knowledge and tradition. The memory of Rome's grandeur haunted the West. For centuries, kings, scholars, and clergy would invoke the idea of Rome to justify rule, to structure law, or to inspire people. Rome had fallen politically, but it remained the standard against which all power was measured. The fall of the Western Roman Empire left Europe in a state of uncertainty, but it was far from a blank slate. Across the former imperial territories, new powers were rising. Kingdoms forged from the remnants of Roman authority, Germanic tribes asserting control, and local leaders seeking stability amid chaos. Yet even as these new rulers claimed sovereignty, the imprint of Rome remained everywhere. In the roads that connected towns, in the aqueducts that carried water, in the administrative systems that guided taxation, and in the very idea of empire itself. Take the Ostrogoths in Italy, for example. Under leaders like Theodoric the Great, they sought to preserve Roman order even as they established their own rule. Theodoric did not aim to destroy Rome's legacy, he embraced it. He maintained Roman laws, kept the Senate functioning, and respected the traditions of the people he governed. Roman citizens, initially wary of barbarian rulers, gradually saw that stability was possible. Rome itself, although politically weakened, remained a living city, a symbol, a capital, and a reminder of a civilization that had dominated the known world for centuries. In Gaul, the Franks were slowly consolidating their power. Clovis I, in particular, would become a pivotal figure, uniting tribes under one banner and adopting Roman administrative practices. His conversion to Christianity was not merely a personal spiritual decision. It was a political strategy, one that tied his rule to the moral and cultural authority of the Church, the very institution that had preserved Roman knowledge and law during the collapse. Through these adaptations, the Franks built a foundation that would later support the Carolingian Empire, bridging the ancient Roman world with the emerging medieval order. Even the Vandals in North Africa, the though notorious for their sack of Rome, participated in the continuation of Roman systems. They collected taxes, maintained cities, and engaged in trade across the Mediterranean. Their kingdom, though independent, was still connected to the wider world shaped by Rome's economic networks. The Western Empire may have fallen, but its structures, both practical and conceptual, persisted in the hands of new rulers. Trade, infrastructure, and culture acted as invisible threads linking the fragmented West. Roman roads guided merchants and armies alike, ensuring that commerce continued even under new authorities. Towns and cities, many founded during the Roman period, remained hubs of administration and trade. Monasteries and churches preserved literacy and learning, keeping classical texts alive and training a new generation in the knowledge of the past. In essence, Rome did not vanish, it transformed, filtered through the lenses of new leaders, new peoples, and new realities. Yet, while continuity existed, so did change. Languages evolved. Latin, once the unifying tongue of the empire, began to diversify into what would become French, Spanish, Italian, and other Romance languages. Customs blended, Roman rituals and festivals merged with local traditions. Law became a hybrid, combining Roman legal principles with tribal codes. The Western world was no longer Roman in a political sense, but it remained Roman in spirit, memory, and practice. Religion played a critical role in this transformation. As emperors faded into insignificance, bishops and abbots became the new authorities, not only in spiritual matters, but also in governance, mediation, and education. The Church provided continuity, stability, and legitimacy in a world where kings and warlords frequently rose and fell. Christian rituals, doctrine, and organization preserved the sense of order that Rome had once imposed through armies and bureaucracy. In many ways, the Church became the new empire, its influence spreading across Europe and linking disparate regions in a shared cultural and spiritual framework. The psychological impact of Rome's fall also lingered. Stories of its grandeur, its conquests, and its fall were retold, forming a collective memory that shaped identity and ambition. Leaders sought to emulate Rome, whether through military conquest, urban planning, or legal codification. The idea of a united, civilized world centered around a single authority, the essence of Rome, remained a guiding vision for centuries, even in their new kingdoms. Former Romans and Germanic rulers alike looked back to the empire for inspiration, authority, and legitimacy. At the same time, Europe was learning to adapt to the realities of a fragmented world. Political power was no longer centralized in one city or held by one ruler. Regional leaders gained authority, forging alliances and rivalries that defined local politics. Mobility, trade, and cultural exchange continued despite the absence of imperial oversight. In this new environment, Europe began to develop the structures, practices, and identities that would define the medieval period. Rome's fall was not an abrupt rupture. It was a transformation, a rebirth of its legacy in a new context. Its roads, laws, cities, and culture did not disappear. They were absorbed, adapted, and carried forward by those who succeeded the empire. The Western world was no longer Roman politically, but the imprint of Rome endured in law, religion, governance, and cultural memory. And yet, even as Europe moved forward, the East, the Byzantine Empire watched, preserved, and occasionally intervened, reminding the West that Rome, though fallen in one place, still existed elsewhere. The story of Rome, in all its complexity, was far from over. While the Western Roman Empire had collapsed politically, its cultural and intellectual legacy remained remarkably resilient. Across Europe, scholars, monks, and local leaders clung to the knowledge and traditions of Rome, understanding that even in the absence of centralized authority, the wisdom of the past could guide the future. Libraries, once concentrated in great cities, were preserved in monasteries and church schools. Ancient texts on law, philosophy, medicine, and astronomy were painstakingly copied by hand, ensuring that generations yet to come could access the intellectual treasures of Rome. Roman law, in particular, became a cornerstone of the emerging European order. Even though political structures had crumbled, the principles of justice, contracts, property, and governance embedded in Roman law were too sophisticated to abandon. Kings and local rulers, many of whom were Germanic in origin, adopted these principles to legitimize their authority and manage their lands. The codification of laws, inspired by Roman precedent, would continue to influence Europe for centuries. The very idea that there could be a systematic, rational approach to governance and justice, one that transcended personal whim or tribal custom, was a gift from Rome that could not be erased. Architecture and engineering, too, carried Rome's imprint, though the grand public works of the empire, forums, amphitheaters, and aqueducts, fell into partial decay. They remained a source of inspiration. Roman roads continued to facilitate travel and trade, connecting cities and regions long after the Western Empire had vanished. Bridges and aqueducts, often repaired and maintained by local populations, allowed towns to thrive in otherwise difficult terrain. Churches built in the Roman style incorporated arches, domes, and columns, blending classical design with Christian symbolism. In this way, the physical legacy of Rome endured alongside its intellectual and legal contributions. Religion was perhaps the most enduring vessel of Roman influence. As the empire weakened, the Christian church gained unprecedented authority. bishops and abbots became not only spiritual leaders, but also administrators, educators, and mediators of justice. Monasteries preserved manuscripts, maintained libraries, and educated new generations in the classical tradition. The Church became the unifying force in a fractured West, offering continuity in governance, morality, and culture where emperors and kings could not. In many respects, the Church became the inheritor of Rome itself, preserving its ideals even as the political empire faded into memory. The synthesis of Roman and Germanic cultures was gradual but profound. Germanic rulers learned from Roman administration, adopting taxation systems, bureaucratic structures, and legal frameworks. Roman citizens, in turn, adapted to the new political realities, negotiating identities that were both Roman and local. This blending created a hybrid culture that defined early medieval Europe, a world where the remnants of empire met the dynamism of tribal kingdoms. Latin, while evolving into the Romance languages, remained the language of law, scholarship, and the Church, bridging the old and the new. Trade, too, reflected the lingering presence of Rome. Mediterranean networks, once under the control of the empire, continued to operate under new powers. North African grain still reached southern Europe. Ports and cities remained vital hubs of commerce, linking cultures, economies, and ideas. Even the so-called barbarian kingdoms benefited from the infrastructure, knowledge, and organizational frameworks left behind by Rome, illustrating that the empire's influence persisted in practical ways long after its political structures had collapsed. Psychologically, the fall of Rome shaped European identity. Stories of the city's greatness, of its legions, emperors, and monumental achievements became both a cautionary tale and a source of aspiration. Leaders invoked Rome to legitimize their rule. Scholars studied its texts to understand philosophy, law, and governance. Artists and architects drew inspiration from its monuments and mosaics. Rome had fallen, yes, but it remained the standard by which civilization measured itself. Its shadow loomed over Europe, guiding, inspiring, and reminding people of what had been lost and what could still be achieved. Yet, the world was not static. While Rome's legacy endured, the West continued to evolve. Kingdoms grew stronger, cities expanded, and trade routes flourished. Cultural and technological innovations emerged, blending Roman traditions with new practices. Europe was gradually transforming into a continent capable of producing its own civilizations, yet always rooted in the foundations laid by Rome. As the centuries passed, the memory of the Western Roman Empire became both myth and guide. It was a story of triumph and tragedy, of human ambition and fragility, and while its political structures had vanished, its ideas, its culture, and its achievements continued to shape the world. The fall of Rome was not an end, it was a transformation, a bridge between the ancient and the medieval, between one era of human civilization and another. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not merely a historical event. It was a profound lesson in the fragility of power, the complexity of governance, and the consequences of societal decay. Centuries later, historians, philosophers, and leaders would look back on Rome's collapse as both a warning and a guide, seeking to understand why one of the greatest civilizations in history could vanish so quietly, without a single defining battle marking its end. One of the most striking elements of Rome's decline was its gradual nature. Unlike sudden conquests or dramatic cataclysms, Rome's fall was a slow unraveling. It did not collapse overnight. It decayed over decades, even centuries. Political instability, economic strain, and social upheaval compounded each other. Emperors were frequently overthrown or assassinated. Civil wars drained resources, weakened loyalty, and demoralized the populace. The once powerful Roman army became reliant on mercenaries, often foreign, whose loyalty was to pay rather than empire. This erosion of central authority meant that no single force could stabilize the West, leaving it vulnerable to the pressures that would eventually end imperial rule. Economic collapse played a pivotal role as well. The empire's vast network of cities, farms, and trade routes required enormous resources to maintain. Inflation, heavy taxation, and reliance on slave labor destabilized the economy. Agricultural production declined, trade networks faltered, and cities shrank. What had once been a system capable of feeding millions and sustaining legions became brittle and vulnerable. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few elites, leaving the majority of people struggling. In many ways, the empire's prosperity created its own fragility. When the systems supporting wealth and power failed, the consequences were catastrophic. Social fragmentation further undermined Rome's resilience. The gap between rich and poor widened, loyalty to the state eroded, and civic responsibility waned. Communities became more inward-looking, relying on local leaders or bishops for guidance rather than distant emperors in Rome. Cultural cohesion, once strengthened by shared identity, language, and law, began to fracture. In the West, local allegiances replaced loyalty to the empire. Germanic tribes, long serving as allies or mercenaries, gradually asserted their own authority, creating kingdoms that blended Roman and local traditions. This transformation was both destructive and creative. Rome's political authority vanished, but the seeds of medieval Europe were planted in the resulting patchwork of power. Yet even in decline, Rome's influence persisted. Legal systems, administrative practices, and cultural traditions continued to shape European societies. Roads, aqueducts, and cities remained vital infrastructure. Christianity, which had survived and even thrived during Rome's final centuries, became the unifying force across fragmented kingdoms. Monasteries and churches safeguarded knowledge, education, and culture. Roman memory became a compass for those navigating the uncertainties of post-imperial life, providing guidance in law, governance, and morality. The fall of Rome also serves as a story of human ambition and limitation. Emperors sought power, generals sought glory, and people sought survival. Yet even their greatest efforts could not prevent the broader structural forces that were at work. Rome's decline reminds us that civilizations are not immortal. They are complex networks of institutions, economies, and cultural norms. When these systems weaken simultaneously, collapse becomes inevitable, even in a society that once seemed unassailable. But from the fall came opportunity. The vacuum left by Rome allowed new cultures to flourish, new kingdoms to rise, and new identities to form. The fusion of Roman tradition with Germanic, Celtic, and other local cultures gave rise to medieval Europe. Political systems, law, religion, and culture were reimagined, borrowing from the past while addressing the realities of a fragmented world. Rome's collapse was not an end, it was a transformation, a necessary reshaping that allowed Europe to emerge stronger, more diverse, and more adaptive. Even today, the story of Rome's fall resonates. It reminds us that power, no matter how absolute it seems, is fragile. That institutions, economies, and social cohesion must be nurtured, or they can crumble. That human ambition, for all its brilliance, is always bound by broader forces. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that even in collapse, legacy endures. Rome's influence, its laws, culture, roads, cities, and ideas, continues to shape the world thousands of years later, proving that while empires may fall, their echoes last forever, even as the Western Roman Empire disappeared into history. Its shadow stretched across the centuries, shaping Europe in ways both profound and subtle. The collapse of political power did not erase the memory of Rome. It transformed it into a cultural, legal, and spiritual legacy that would guide civilizations long after the legions had disbanded and the marble forums had fallen silent. Throughout the medieval period, kings and emperors looked back to Rome as the ultimate model of authority and legitimacy. Charlemagne, crowned in 800 AD as Emperor of the Romans, consciously invoked Rome to legitimize his reign, signaling a revival of imperial ideals in a Europe that had long been fractured. The Holy Roman Empire, centuries later, would carry the name and the dream of Rome, striving to emulate its administrative order, legal traditions, and vision of a unified Christian world. Rome's authority, though no longer tangible in armies and borders, became symbolic an idea powerful enough to inspire generations of rulers, thinkers, and architects. Roman law, preserved in texts and taught in monastic schools, became the backbone of European legal systems. The Justinian Code, compiled in the Eastern Empire, but known and studied in the West, influenced the formation of modern civil law. Property rights, contracts, trials, and governance drew upon principles developed centuries earlier in the courts of Rome. These legal foundations provided continuity, allowing societies to function and flourish even in a politically fragmented landscape. In a sense, Rome lived on in the way people negotiated justice, order, and civic responsibility. Architecture and engineering carried the empire's legacy in another form. Stone bridges, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and temples continued to inspire medieval builders. Churches, castles, and civic buildings drew upon Roman arches, domes, and columns, blending ancient techniques with contemporary needs. Roads constructed by Roman engineers remained crucial for travel, trade, and military movement, ensuring that the infrastructure of the empire continued to bind Europe together, even as new kingdoms rose. Cities that had been Roman administrative centers became medieval hubs. Their layouts, marketplaces, and public spaces shaped by the memory of imperial organization. The Christian Church, which had grown increasingly powerful during the late Empire, became the guardian of Roman memory. Bishops, abbots, and monks preserved manuscripts, taught Latin, and maintained institutions of learning. The Church provided stability, unity, and continuity in a world that had lost centralized political authority. Its influence extended into law, politics, and culture, ensuring that the moral and intellectual achievements of Rome endured. Through religion, the ideas, values, and structures of the empire reached communities far beyond the city of Rome itself. Even cultural memory played a role. Stories of Rome's greatness, of its conquests, its emperors, and its monumental architecture were passed down in chronicles, poems, and oral tradition. The very notion of empire, citizenship, and civilization was filtered through the Roman lens. Leaders invoked Rome to inspire loyalty. Scholars referenced it to teach ethics and governance, and artists sought to capture its grandeur in stone, fresco, and manuscript. The empire may have fallen, but the image of Rome remained powerful, a standard of human achievement against which future generations measured themselves. The fall of Rome also provided lessons about fragility and resilience. It illustrated the dangers of overextension, the importance of social cohesion, the risks of economic strain, and the consequences of political instability. It demonstrated that no matter how advanced or powerful a civilization may appear, it remains vulnerable to internal decay and external pressures. And yet, it also showed that knowledge, culture, and infrastructure can survive the collapse of political institutions, influencing the course of history in ways that last far beyond the lifetime of any empire. In the modern world, the echoes of Rome are everywhere. Legal systems, government structures, urban planning, literature, language, and even architecture carry traces of Roman thought. The very concept of Western civilization is inseparable from the memory of Rome's achievements and failures. Every time a law is written, a road is built, or a government balances power and authority, the ghost of Rome is there, silent, enduring, and instructive. The story of Rome is not one of simple triumph or defeat. It is a story of transformation, of adaptation, and of lasting influence. The Western Empire fell, but it left behind a blueprint for governance, culture, and society that would shape Europe and the wider world for millennia. Its collapse reminds us that empires, like all human creations, are mortal, but their ideas, institutions, and legacies can endure far longer than the rulers who once claimed their thrones. And so, the fall of Rome, quiet and inevitable, does not feel like an ending. It feels like a bridge. A bridge from the ancient world to the medieval, from empire to kingdom, from chaos to continuity. The Western Empire may have disappeared, but Rome itself, its ideals, its knowledge, and its memory remains eternal. The story of Rome is the story of civilization itself. Ambitious, fragile, yet profoundly enduring, reaching across time to remind us of both the heights humanity can achieve and the lessons we must never forget. Even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the world that Rome had shaped continued to pulse with its influence, often in subtle, almost invisible ways. Europe was no longer ruled from a marble palace in the heart of the city, but the structures, ideas, and culture of Rome lived on in the very veins of the continent. The roads laid by Roman engineers still connected towns and cities, guiding merchants, armies, and travelers. Bridges and aqueducts, some still standing, carried water and trade, silently reminding everyone who crossed them of the empire that had built them. The kingdoms that arose from Rome's remnants, Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy, Franks in Gaul, were not simply barbarian states replacing the empire. They were hybrids, blending Roman administration with Germanic tradition. Leaders maintained Roman law where it suited them, kept cities functioning, and often relied on Roman officials to govern their territories. In this way, Rome became less a political entity and more a guiding framework. Its bureaucracy, legal principles, and infrastructure were like a skeleton around which the new Europe could form, giving shape and stability to a fragmented world. Education and knowledge became one of the most enduring legacies of Rome. Monasteries and cathedrals preserved manuscripts of ancient texts, painstakingly copying works of philosophy, science, history, and law. Scholars studied Cicero, Seneca, and Livy, drawing lessons about governance, virtue, and the dangers of corruption. Latin remained the language of learning and communication across Europe, connecting disparate kingdoms through a shared intellectual heritage. The very act of preserving knowledge, often in candlelit rooms with quills scratching on parchment, ensured that Rome's ideas would survive centuries of political instability. Religion, too, had become inseparable from the Roman legacy. The Church, which had flourished during the empire's last days, emerged as a dominant force in medieval Europe. Bishops and abbots took on responsibilities once held by emperors, adjudicating disputes, organizing resources, and even influencing the succession of kings. Christianity, carried and shaped by Roman infrastructure and thought, became the unifying thread in a fractured world. The rituals, hierarchies, and legal structures of the Church preserved continuity, creating a new kind of empire, not of soldiers and borders, but of belief, culture, and law. Yet, alongside preservation, there was transformation. Roman towns evolved into medieval cities. Roman roads guided new trade networks, and Roman law inspired evolving codes adapted to local customs. The empire's collapse allowed innovation to flourish. New political structures emerged, combining Roman ideas of citizenship and governance with the decentralized realities of tribal and regional power. Art and architecture adapted Roman forms into Gothic cathedrals and fortified castles. The fall of Rome was thus not an erasure. It was a seedbed for new civilizations, deeply rooted in the past, yet reaching toward the future. The memory of Rome also served as a mirror for human ambition and fragility. Chroniclers and thinkers pondered how a civilization so vast and seemingly invincible could disintegrate. They traced the causes: overextension, economic mismanagement, social inequality, political corruption, and external pressures. In studying Rome, they discovered a cautionary tale that even the mightiest societies are mortal, and that power without prudence and prosperity without sustainability can vanish almost as quietly as it arose. Over time, Rome's story became mythic. It was a tale told to inspire, to instruct, and to warn. Leaders invoked Rome to legitimize rule. Architects and engineers looked to its monuments for guidance. Scholars sought to preserve its wisdom. Even in its absence, Rome's influence shaped human thought and action. The empire had fallen, yes, but the world it had built through roads, laws, cities, art, and ideas continued to guide humanity in ways both grand and subtle. By the time medieval Europe fully emerged, the Western Roman Empire was gone as a political entity. Yet its presence was felt in every corner, from the codified laws that regulated society to the cities that acted as centers of commerce and governance, to the monasteries that preserved learning and culture. Rome's imprint was everywhere. Its legacy had transformed from concrete power into enduring influence, a civilization that outlived its own fall. The story of Rome reminds us that history is rarely clean or simple. Empires rise and fall, yet ideas, knowledge, and culture persist. Rome's fall was not the end of its story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would shape the world for centuries. And as we look back, we see not only ruins and fragments, but the enduring structures of thought, law, and culture that continue to define humanity today. In the quiet streets of Europe, in the echoes of Latin phrases, in the arches of bridges and domes of cathedrals, Rome still speaks, its story of ambition, grandeur, vulnerability, and resilience, forever intertwined with the history of civilization itself.